Since 2006, the total cost of healthcare per employee has risen 75%, while the median annual salary of full-time American workers has grown by only 25%. And annually, employers spend nearly $880 billion on healthcare for their workers, making it difficult for companies to hire and invest in new workers.
Progressive entrepreneur Joe Sanberg writes that Medicare for All is one of the best things that the country can do to create better paying jobs, faster growth, and a more competitive market. Sanberg also notes the American dream may be off limits for many Americans who fear taking the risk to start a business will result in the loss of their employer-provided health insurance. Here to explain more is progressive entrepreneur and co-founder of Aspiration, Joe Sanberg. Great to have you, sir.
Good to see you.
Good morning.
This is a case that I'm always confused why progressives don't make more about Medicare for All, which is that, look, it helps people to be able to have the courage to step out on their own if they want to start a business. It helps existing businesses, takes these healthcare costs off their books. Make the case for people.
Absolutely. Look, when you're a risk taker, there are certain risks you just can't take. And the highest among those risks is you can't take a chance with your own health and with your family's health. And so when millions of entrepreneurs are facing the choice between starting a new business or not being able to take their kids to the doctor, they can't become that entrepreneur that is sort of elevated by the American dream. And you see it in the stats. Well, the media might narrate a different image. Entrepreneurship is at a 40-year low in the United States. And it's especially low among women and people of color. And I think the reason is really straightforward. People are having to choose between starting a business and having health insurance. And if we take that terrible choice off the table and ensure everyone health insurance, we're going to see more entrepreneurship, especially by women and people of color.
So this is what I've always been fascinated by on the pro-business case, because the truth is, like, we can't have Medicare for all unless we have a pretty dramatic hike in a payroll tax, which is also something that would affect workers. So how do you balance that into your calculus? Because payroll tax, of course, is paid both by employers and by workers, could basically be the same thing and as prohibitive to risk.
Well, I think there's a debate about that. We could also fund Medicare for all through much higher taxes on monopolies and creating a much more progressive corporate tax rate. You know, we have progressivity in the income tax schedule, but not nearly the same progressivity in the corporate income tax schedule. Why is Amazon paying the same rate that a business a quarter or 1/20th of its size is paying? So I would suggest to the counter that we fund Medicare for all by taxing monopolies. And of course, we can't overlook Stephanie Kelton's great arguments in the deficit myth, which is this idea that we have to necessarily, quote unquote, pay for it at all, is born of specious thinking that's dominated our politics over the last couple of decades.
Well, and I think that's one of the myths that's been exposed during the pandemic is suddenly, you know, when Wall Street needed money, trillions, no problem, and lots of money has flown out the door with these exigent circumstances. I would say they need to do certainly even more. But I think that, to me, that's sort of taken that argument off the table. What other ways do you think that the pandemic has changed the way that the American people are thinking about healthcare and especially about employer-linked health insurance?
Well, I have a hunch that in the years to come, we'll look back on this pandemic as the moment that ended any popularity of employer-linked health insurance. We have a pandemic that's created an unemployment crisis. I mean, think about the irony of that. We have a health crisis that's created an unemployment crisis, and we have a health insurance system that depends on employment. So it's a perfect recipe of toxic ingredients that I think is unpacked once and for all how totally stupid the current system is.
And so, Joe, I guess the real thing I'm curious here is we've heard the pro-union case and the pro-employer case. All of this seems to be kind of about unbundling the types of risk that a business or costs that a business has to incur in order to encourage entrepreneurship. Is that right? Is that how I'm understanding this case?
Well, I think there's a lot of elements to it. There's also the element of businesses don't want to be in the job of health insurance administration.
Right.
And we're forcing businesses and entrepreneurs who are trying to build innovative goods and services to spend time administering health insurance instead of trying to create new products and services that people want. There's also the factor, and I think this resonates greatly with me, which is, you know, if you're negotiating over health insurance, you don't have time to negotiate over wages. And I believe that employer-linked health insurance has been one of the many factors for the power imbalance between workers and businesses that's caused wage stagnation.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. Last question for you. This is not directly related to health insurance, but while we have you, I wanted to get your thoughts. We're seeing perhaps 40% of small businesses being forced to permanently shut their doors because of the pandemic. Meanwhile, the largest mega companies set to get, they're doing phenomenally well. They're set to get even larger. What can we do? I actually didn't know that stat about entrepreneurship being at a 30-year low. Like, what else can we do to be able to rebuild these businesses, to recreate a flourishing small business environment? Because, it's not just devastating for those business owners. It's devastating for local communities when everything except for like the Walmart and the Wendy's gets stripped out for it. No, maybe an Amazon fulfillment center in the shell of what used to be the local mall.
First of all, we have to talk about this so much more. Genuinely, it should be keeping us up at night, worrying about how we're leaving the power of our economy in the hands of 5, 7, 10 companies. We cannot have a democracy when our economy is controlled by a few giant monopolies. We have a massive monopoly problem in the United States, and the answer has to include antitrust enforcement. It has to. There's no solution that doesn't include a new imagination around what antitrust means for these information tech platforms. And until we get to that, we're just nibbling around the edges of the problem. And if we don't attack the problem head on with antitrust, this dystopian future of no small businesses and we're all working and buying from, half a dozen companies is going to be where we end up in our lifetime. In fact, it could be where we end up in this decade.
Yeah, I think it's a good case. Thank you. We really appreciate it, Joe.
Great to have you, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you.
Still to come, a showdown between old guard and new incumbents and challengers. The Intercept's Ryan Grimm breaks down the results of the Massachusetts primary when Rising returns.